The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl dragged through scrap metal, and his retaliation shook the entire yard. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The wind howled across the scrapyard, sending loose pieces of metal clattering against each other. It was a cold, unforgiving afternoon when Jake Razor Morrison, a seasoned Hells Angels biker, rode his motorcycle down the long, desolate road that led to the yard. The familiar hum of his Harley-Davidson beneath him was comforting, almost like a second heartbeat. His leather jacket flapped in the wind, the patches on his back making a statement of who he was: tough, fearless, and always ready for what life threw at him. As he approached the scrapyard, he saw a flash of movement ahead. His eyes narrowed beneath the dark visor of his helmet. There, on the ground, a small figure was being dragged through the twisted wreckage of old cars, scrap metal, and broken machinery. The girl was no older than 8, her legs kicking helplessly as a larger, brutish man pulled her by her arm. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts immediately kicking in. He slowed his bike, carefully calculating his next move. This wasn't something he had expected to see today, but it didn't matter. He wasn't one to turn away from a fight, especially when the innocent were involved. Without hesitation, he cut the engine of his bike and stepped off, his boots hitting the gravel with a purposeful thud. The man dragging the girl didn't even notice him approach, too focused on his malicious task. Jake's eyes flicked to the girl, who looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. She was crying, her clothes torn, her face bruised, and the pain was written all over her expression. It was clear that the man had no intention of stopping, no remorse for what he was doing. Jake's grip tightened around the handle of the crowbar he had grabbed from the bike side. The man heard the sound of footsteps, but before he could turn around, Jake was already upon him. Silently, her tears beginning to subside, Jake's gaze shifted to the wreckage around them. The scrapyard was full of danger, full of people who didn't care about the weak. But now, it had a different meaning. It was a place where Jake had made a stand, where the innocent could be protected. He gave the girl a reassuring smile, knowing he had done the right thing. His retaliation had shaken the entire yard, but more importantly, it had saved her life. The wind had calmed, but the tension in the air lingered. Jake stood still, his chest rising and falling as he watched the little girl clutch his jacket, her small body trembling with the aftershocks of the chaos that had just unfolded. The scrapyard around them, once a place of desolate quiet, now felt like a battleground where only one side had emerged victorious. Jake's mind raced. He had done what he always did. He had stepped in when others wouldn't, protecting the innocent. But there was something about this situation that felt different. The girl's wide, tear-streaked eyes staring up at him as she clung to his side stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in a long time. He had always been the one to protect, never to be protected. But this child, this vulnerable soul who had trusted him, had cracked the armor he had worn for years. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for someone to see beyond the Hells Angels biker, to see the man beneath the hardened exterior. With a soft sigh, Jake turned away from the wreckage and began to walk, guiding the girl with him. Her tiny footsteps struggled to keep up with his long stride, but she was determined to stay close. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you somewhere safe," Jake muttered, his voice gruff but steady. As they walked, the sound of his boots crunching on the gravel seemed louder than usual, almost as if the quiet of the scrapyard had followed them. The girl's hand was still gripping his jacket, her small fingers holding on with a strength that belied her size. She didn't say anything, but Jake could feel her fear radiating from her. She had been through something traumatic, something no child should ever have to experience. And yet, here she was, trusting him to keep her safe. Jake glanced down at her, his heart tightening. At the sight of her bruised face and the dirt streaked across her clothes, she looked like she hadn't eaten in days. His mind wandered for a moment, back to the days when he had been a kid, lost in the world, trying to survive the only way he knew how. The same way this girl had been surviving, by fighting, by holding on to what little hope she had left. The same way he had. But he had survived. He had become the man he was today, and now, it was his turn to make sure she didn't have to face the world alone. They reached his bike, and Jake bent down to help the girl climb onto the back. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at him with wide eyes. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice softening. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." She nodded slowly, and with Jake's help, she climbed on. He started the engine, the familiar rumble of his Harley cutting through the silence. As they rode away from the scrapyard, Jake felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. But it was fleeting. He knew this wasn't over. The man who had hurt the girl would be back. People like him didn't just disappear. They always came back. But Jake wasn't worried. He had dealt with worse. He had faced down men who were far more dangerous than the one he had just knocked to the ground. And he would do it again if it meant keeping this little girl safe. He glanced over his shoulder to see the girl, her small hands clutching the sides of his jacket, her face pressed against his back. For a moment, she seemed peaceful, as though she had found some kind of comfort in his presence. Jake could only hope that it was enough. He didn't know where he was taking her, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go. Not yet. Not until he knew she was safe. They rode for miles, the wind rushing past them as the sun began to set on the horizon. The last rays of daylight bathed the road in a warm, golden glow, but Jake didn't notice. His mind was focused on what he needed to do next. He needed to find out more about the girl. Who had done this to her? Why had she been dragged through the scrapyard? And who else was out there, waiting to hurt her again? As the miles passed, Jake's thoughts raced. He couldn't protect her forever. He couldn't keep her hidden away from the world. But for now, he would do what he could. He would keep her safe. And if anyone tried to hurt her again, they would have to go through him first. The road ahead stretched out before them, long and endless, but Jake was ready. He had made a decision, and nothing would stop him now. They rode on, the engine's roar echoing in the fading light. The sun had nearly disappeared beyond the horizon as Jake rode through the quiet streets of the small town, his Harley cutting through the silence. The girl, now nestled behind him, still clung to his jacket, her small body pressed against his back for warmth and comfort. Jake could feel her presence, a weight that had become both a responsibility and a promise he wasn't sure how to fulfill. His mind raced with questions, each one more pressing than the last. Who was she? Why had she been in that scrapyard? And who the hell was behind the violence that had brought her to him? He glanced over his shoulder at the girl. She was still silent, her eyes fixed on the road behind them as if she was trying to avoid looking at the present. Jake's stomach churned with guilt. It wasn't the first time he had encountered a victim of violence. But something about this felt different. The girl was so small, so innocent, and yet, she had already seen more than any child ever should. Jake's mind drifted to the past, to his own childhood, to the things he had endured. He had survived the streets, the pain, the loss, but he had always had the option to fight back. This girl, though, she had no one except him. Jake's hands tightened on the handlebars as he navigated through the streets. The closer they got to his garage, the more his mind raced. What could he do to help her? What if the people who had hurt her came looking for her? What if they came after him? He wasn't afraid to face danger. He had been doing it his whole life. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about her, and the promise he had made to protect her. He finally pulled up to the garage, the place where his life had been rebuilt time and time again. It wasn't much, just a small, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of town, but it had been his refuge, his sanctuary from the chaos of the world. Jake cut the engine and slid off the bike, helping the girl down. She was still stiff, hesitant, as if she didn't fully trust him yet. He could understand that. Trust wasn't something that came easily, especially after what she had been through. Jake led her inside, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The smell of motor oil and rust filled the air, a familiar scent that had always brought him comfort. But today, it felt different. Today, it felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. He turned on the dim lights, revealing the cluttered space filled with old motorcycle parts, tools, and half-finished projects. The girl stood by the door, unsure of where to go, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something familiar. "You can sit down," Jake said, his voice softer than usual. "I'll get you something to drink." He walked over to a small fridge in the corner and grabbed a bottle of water. He handed it to her, watching as she took it with both hands, her small fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake gave her a small nod. No problem. You're safe here. The words felt hollow even as he said them. He wasn't sure if she would believe him. She had been hurt, betrayed, and now she was here with him. A man who had spent his life building walls, both around himself and those he cared about. But something had shifted in him today. Something had broken. He had promised to protect her, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The girl took a sip of water, her eyes never leaving the floor. Jake stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had never been good with words, especially not with people who had been through what she had. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her here alone. He couldn't just send her back into the world that had hurt her. What's your name? Jake finally asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. The girl hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not she should trust him with the answer. Emily, she said quietly. Jake nodded. Emily, you don't have to worry about anything here. You're safe. She didn't respond, but Jake could see the slight flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. As the silence stretched on, Jake knew that there was no going back. He had already made the choice to protect her, and now he would have to live with the consequences. He turned away, walking to a workbench at the far end of the garage. He needed to focus, to keep his mind busy. I'll make you something to eat, Jake said, trying to break the tension in the air. Emily nodded silently, still unsure. Jake set to work, chopping vegetables for a quick meal, his mind still racing with thoughts of the girl and the danger she was in. He didn't know how long they would be safe here, but he did know one thing. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt her again. He finished preparing the meal, setting the small table in the corner of the garage. Here, he said, placing a plate in front of Emily. She glanced up at him, her eyes still wary but softening. Thank you, she whispered again. Jake nodded and took a seat across from her. The meal was simple, just a few vegetables and some rice, but it felt like the first real meal he had shared with anyone in years. The silence between them was comfortable now, not filled with the tension that had marked their first moments together. As they ate, Jake found himself watching her more closely. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was strong, resilient, and he could see it in the way she carried herself, even in the face of everything she had been through. And he knew that, no matter what happened, he would do whatever it took to make sure she never had to face the world alone again. The evening passed in a quiet rhythm, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of paper as Jake cleaned the garage. Emily, sitting at the table, watched him with quiet curiosity. She was no longer trembling, but the weight of the day's events was still heavy on her shoulders. The bruises on her face had faded slightly, but her eyes still held the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. Jake could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't mind. He had his own demons to fight, and right now, those demons were quiet. The only thing that mattered was keeping her safe. The sun had fully set, and the garage was now lit by the soft glow of a single overhead light. Jake set down his tools and turned to face Emily. I'm going to make a call, he said, his voice low. Emily looked up at him, her expression unreadable. To who? She asked quietly. Jake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to tell her. Someone who might be able to help. He reached for his phone and dialed a number from memory. The phone rang 3 times before the voice on the other end picked up. Jake. The voice said, a gravelly tone that Jake knew well. What do you need? I need some information. A girl. She's been through hell, and I can't do this alone. Jake replied, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency. There was a pause on the other end of the line. You're asking the wrong guy, but I'll see what I can do. Where are you? I'm in Cedar Ridge. The old warehouse on Maple Street, Jake said, looking over at Emily as he spoke. He could see her trying to listen, but she wasn't asking questions. She was just waiting. The voice on the other end gave a low grunt. Stay put. I'll send someone over. You're sure about this? Yeah, Jake replied, his jaw tightening. Just do it, Steele. No time to waste. He ended the call before Steele could respond. Jake slid his phone into his pocket and looked at Emily. We're not safe here for long, he said, his voice grim. Emily looked up at him, a glimmer of fear flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? She asked, her voice shaky. The people who hurt you, Jake began, his tone softening slightly. They'll come looking, and when they do, I'll make sure they don't get to you. Emily nodded slowly, but her unease was evident. Who were they? Why did they do this? She asked. Jake rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the question. He had been trying to avoid this conversation, but there was no way around it now. They're part of a gang, he said quietly, his voice darkening. A group that does more than just run the streets. They hurt people, take what they want, and leave nothing behind. Emily's eyes widened in fear. But why me? She whispered. Jake paused, looking out into the dimly lit garage as he gathered his thoughts. I don't know, but I'll make sure they don't hurt you again. The silence in the room felt heavy, the tension thick in the air. Jake stood and walked over to a small cabinet, retrieving a first aid kit. He had learned to take care of himself over the years, but there was something different about caring for someone else. Emily's eyes followed him, but she didn't move. Sit back down, he said gently, motioning toward the table. Emily obeyed, her small form stiff with uncertainty. Jake returned to the table and opened the kit, beginning to clean the cuts and bruises on her face and arms. His hands moved with the practiced care of someone who had done this for himself countless times. But there was something more tender about the way he treated her. Emily flinched slightly as he applied the antiseptic to a cut on her cheek, but she didn't pull away. Sorry, Jake muttered, feeling a pang of guilt. Emily shook her head. It's okay, she said softly. It doesn't hurt as much now. Jake finished cleaning her wounds and sat back, looking at her. She was still so small, so fragile, and yet she had already survived so much. He could see the strength in her, even if she couldn't see it in herself. You're stronger than you think, Jake said, his voice firm but quiet. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But I don't know what to do, she whispered. I don't know who to trust anymore. Jake leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he thought. I get it, he said softly. But you don't have to face this alone. I've got your back, no matter what. Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time since he had found her, Jake saw a flicker of hope in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake stood up, stretching his arms before he turned toward the door. I'm going to make sure everything is set up for the night. Stay here, he said, his voice more commanding now. I'll be back in a minute. Emily nodded, her gaze following him as he walked to the door. She was still scared, still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of safety that she hadn't felt before. As Jake stepped outside, he took a deep breath, his mind focused on the task at hand. He had promised to protect her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. The night had fallen completely by the time Jake returned to the garage, the sounds of his boots echoing through the empty space. The silence was oppressive, but there was something comforting about it, something familiar. He walked in to find Emily sitting exactly where he had left her, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, but softening as she looked up at him. She hadn't moved much, still wrapped in the blankets he had given her earlier. The small table was cleared of the plate, and the water bottle was now empty, but Emily didn't seem to mind. She was deep in thought, her gaze focused on the cracked wall in front of her. Jake didn't disturb her immediately, taking a moment to appreciate the stillness. He had done his best to shield her from the world outside, but he knew that sooner or later, the past would come crashing back. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out quickly, glancing at the screen. Steele. His fingers tightened around the device, and he swiped to answer. Jake. The voice on the other end was low, tense. I've got some news for you. The girl's not safe. They're onto her. Jake's heart sank. What do you mean they're onto her? He asked, his voice sharp. Who? The ones who hurt her. I've been tracking their movements, and it looks like they know she's been taken. They've been asking questions. People are talking, Jake. It's only a matter of time before they find her, Steele replied, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration building in his chest. How much time do we have? He asked. Steele paused before answering. Not much. Maybe. A few hours. You need to move her, now? Get her out of there before they show up. Jake glanced over at Emily, still sitting quietly at the table. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together in a way that made Jake's stomach twist. He had promised her safety, but now it seemed the world was closing in on them. He nodded, even though Steele couldn't see him. I'll take care of it. Thanks for the heads up. He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket. His mind raced as he walked over to Emily. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. What's wrong? She asked, her voice small and vulnerable. I have to move you. They know where you are, Jake said, his voice firm but not without a trace of regret. Emily's eyes widened, panic starting to creep into her expression. Who? She whispered. The people who hurt you, Jake replied, his jaw tightening. But don't worry. I'm not going to let them get to you. We'll be gone before they even know what happened. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of trust. It was small, but it was there. I'll be right here, okay? He said, kneeling in front of her, making sure she understood. I won't let anything happen to you. Emily nodded silently, but Jake could see the tremble in her hands as she clasped them in her lap. You don't have to be scared. We're leaving now, and I'll make sure you're safe. Emily looked up at him, her expression softer now, the fear still there, but not as sharp. Where are we going? She asked. Jake stood up and extended his hand to her. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find you. She took his hand without hesitation, and they walked together toward the door. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Jake's mind was already working through the next steps. He had to move quickly. Steele was right. Time was running out. They couldn't afford to wait. He had to get her out of town, out of the reach of the people who would stop at nothing to hurt her. He didn't know exactly where they were going yet, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to stop until she was safe. The bike roared too. Life as Jake started the engine. Emily climbed on behind him, her small body stiff at first, but she held on tightly, her hands gripping his jacket just as she had before. They rode through the empty streets, the wind rushing past them, carrying with it the sounds of the world that was quickly fading behind them. As they reached the edge of town, Jake glanced over his shoulder at Emily. She was still there, still holding on, still trusting him despite everything. And that trust was all he needed to keep moving forward. They rode on, the dark road ahead of them stretching into the unknown, but Jake didn't feel afraid. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. They were going to get through this. Together. The road stretched out before them, dark and endless. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, the rumble of his Harley echoing through the empty night. Emily's grip on his jacket remained tight, her small hands clutching the fabric with determination. The wind whipped past them, carrying with it the chill of the night, but it did little to ease the weight pressing down on Jake's chest. He knew they couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, the people chasing them would catch up, and when they did, Jake had no intention of letting them get anywhere near Emily. The city lights slowly faded behind them as they ventured into the more rural stretches of land. It was the kind of place Jake knew well, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, and where people like him could slip away unnoticed. He had been here before, hiding from the past, trying to outrun it. Now, though, he wasn't running from the past. He was running to something. To someone. Emily. They had been riding for hours, the only sound between them the steady hum of the engine. Emily hadn't said much since they left the garage, but Jake could feel the tension in her, the weight of everything that had happened still pressing down on her small shoulders. She was trying to stay strong, but Jake knew she was terrified, and he couldn't blame her. He had been where she was. He had seen what she had seen, felt what she had felt. But the difference was, he had survived. He had learned how to fight, how to protect himself. But Emily was still learning, and that was why Jake had to be there for her. They needed to find safety, fast. Jake had a place in mind, a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where he could lay low for a while. It wasn't much, but it would be enough. For now. As they approached the cabin, Jake slowed the bike, glancing around to make sure they weren't being followed. The cabin sat nestled between the trees, dark and quiet, the perfect place to hide. He pulled the bike to a stop, cutting the engine. The only sound now was the rustling of the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. We're here, Jake said softly, turning his head to look at Emily. She looked up at him, her face still pale, but with a flicker of something in her eyes. Relief, maybe. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see she was grateful. She was safe, for now. Jake helped her off the bike, and they made their way to the cabin's door. It was old, the wood worn and weathered, but it was sturdy. Jake fumbled with the key, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The inside was sparse but functional. A bed in the corner, a small kitchen, and a few chairs around a wooden table. It wasn't much, but it was all Jake needed. He turned to Emily as she stepped inside, her eyes taking in the room. You can sleep here tonight, he said, pointing to the bed. I'll keep watch. Emily nodded and sat down on the bed, looking up at Jake with those wide, uncertain eyes. Jake's heart tightened at the sight of her. She had been through so much already, and he couldn't help but feel responsible for her. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. "I'll make sure you're safe," he said softly, trying to reassure her. Emily didn't respond, but she lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket up around her shoulders. She looked small, fragile, as if the weight of the world had settled on her tiny frame. Jake stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before turning to the window. He had done everything he could to protect her so far, but he knew the real challenge was yet to come. They weren't out of danger yet. The people after Emily would stop at nothing to find her. And when they did, Jake would be ready. He had faced worse before, and he wasn't afraid to face it again. But this time, it was different. This time, there was someone he had to protect. Someone who needed him. As the night wore on, Jake remained at the window, keeping a watchful eye on the darkened road outside. He knew the danger wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones, the uneasy stillness in the air. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for someone else's future. And he wasn't going to lose that fight. Hours passed, the night growing colder, but Jake didn't move from his post. He remained vigilant, waiting, listening for any sign that the danger was approaching. Emily slept soundly on the bed behind him, the soft sound of her breathing filling the room. Jake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder every now and then, checking to make sure she was still safe. He had promised to protect her, and he would keep that promise, no matter what it took. The night stretched on, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they came. But for now, all he could do was wait. Wait, and keep her safe. The quiet of the night was shattered by the sound of an engine rumbling in the distance. Jake's head snapped toward the window, his senses immediately on high alert. He had been expecting this, but that didn't make the tension in his chest any easier to bear. The faint sound of motorcycles, unmistakable and unmistakably close, grew louder by the second. Emily, still curled up on the bed, stirred slightly but remained asleep. Jake's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he kept in his jacket pocket. The shadows outside had begun to move, the flicker of headlights cutting through the darkness. He knew it was only a matter of time before the people who had been hunting Emily would find them. His promise to keep her safe weighed heavily on him. But Jake was no stranger to danger. He had dealt with far worse in his life. The question wasn't whether he could handle the situation, but whether he could keep her out of harm's way long enough for them to escape. The rumbling of the bikes grew louder, unmistakably close now, and Jake's mind raced. There was no more time to wait. The danger was here. "Emily," Jake said softly, turning toward her. Her eyes opened slowly, her expression still clouded by sleep. "Stay down. Don't make a sound, no matter what happens," he instructed, his voice steady but urgent. Emily's eyes met his, confusion and fear evident in them, but she nodded silently. She trusted him, and that trust was the only thing keeping her calm in this moment. Jake moved quickly to the door, locking it quietly but securely. He checked the windows, scanning the dark yard outside for any signs of movement. The bikes were close now, parked just outside the cabin, their engines idling. He could hear the voices of men, low and gruff, as they dismounted and began to move toward the door. The familiar weight of the gun in Jake's hand gave him a sense of calm as he made his way to the back of the cabin. He crouched by the window, his eyes narrowing as he watched the men approach. There were 4 of them, big, menacing, dressed in black leather, their faces hidden behind helmets. Jake knew who they were. They were the ones who had hurt Emily, the ones who wouldn't stop until they found her. His jaw tightened, the anger building within him. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that promise away. He looked back at Emily, still huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. She was terrified, and rightfully so. But Jake couldn't let that fear consume him. He had to stay calm, stay focused. He had to be the protector now. The footsteps outside grew louder as the men approached the door. Jake's fingers tightened around the gun as he stood up, moving silently to the back exit. He had to be smart, strategic. If they were going to get out of this alive, he had to outsmart them, use the element of surprise. He turned to Emily one last time. "Stay quiet. Stay hidden. Don't move unless I say so," he whispered. Emily nodded, her face pale, but she trusted him. with one last glance. Jake moved to the back door, sliding it open just a crack. The cold night air hit his skin, but he didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. The men were right outside now, and Jake could hear their voices more clearly. They were laughing, making threats, sure they had caught their prey. "She's in there, I know it," one of them said, his voice rough and low. "She won't get away this time." Jake gritted his teeth, his body tensing. He couldn't let them think they had the upper hand. He had to move quickly, decisively. With a deep breath, Jake slipped outside, blending into the shadows. The men were still talking, their backs turned as they approached the door. Jake used this moment of distraction to make his move. He crept silently, staying low, moving like a ghost. The first man never saw it coming. Jake lunged at him from behind, his hands finding the man's throat and pulling him to the ground with a muffled thud. The second man turned just in time to see Jake's fist coming at his face, the punch landing with a satisfying crunch. The third and fourth men barely had time to react before Jake was on them, taking them down one by one with swift, calculated moves. He was faster than they expected, stronger than they gave him credit for. Within moments, all four men were lying on the ground, groaning in pain, unable to fight back. Jake stood over them, breathing heavily but focused. "This is your warning," he growled, looking down at the men. "Stay the hell away from her." He turned to head back to the cabin, but the sound of footsteps approaching quickly made him freeze. More of them. More bikers. Jake's heart raced as he looked back at Emily, who was now standing by the window, her eyes wide with terror. They hadn't come far enough to escape yet. He was out of time. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. He wasn't ready to let them take what he had promised to protect. With a quick glance toward the men on the ground, Jake sprinted back to the cabin, moving faster than ever before. Emily's safety depended on him. He couldn't afford to fail now. Jake's breath came in sharp bursts as he slammed the door shut behind him. The cold, harsh wind from outside howled through the cracks of the old wooden cabin, but it didn't matter anymore. They had made it in, but the battle was far from over. Emily was already at the window, her eyes wide with fear as she peered through the thin curtain, watching for any sign of the men. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he moved toward her. His mind raced, processing everything that had just happened. For men on the ground, sure, but they weren't the only ones looking for Emily. More were out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. He had only one chance to protect her now. "Stay down," he said softly but firmly, his voice rough from the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Emily nodded, fear evident in her wide eyes, but she trusted him. She always had, even when things seemed impossible. He wasn't sure if he was capable of keeping her safe from everything the world was about to throw at them, but he wasn't going to stop trying. He turned toward the back door, his mind already working through their escape plan. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was all they had. The small cabin was too exposed, too easy to find. They needed to move fast, before the bikers realized what had happened. Jake quickly checked the window, scanning the dark landscape outside. The last thing he wanted was to get cornered. He glanced back at Emily, who was sitting quietly, her face pale but composed. She was doing her best to stay calm, to trust him, and that gave him more strength than he ever thought he'd have. "I'm going to get you out of here," Jake muttered under his breath. He wasn't sure where they'd go next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Not again. He opened the back door slowly, peeking out into the night. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of the men yet, but Jake knew they wouldn't stay down for long. He grabbed a small duffel bag from the corner, quickly stuffing a few essentials inside. A couple of extra guns, some cash, and a few changes of clothes. He had to move quickly. The sound of a motorcycle revving in the distance made him freeze. His head snapped toward the window again. They were coming. Jake cursed. Under his breath, his instincts kicking in as he slammed the bag shut. He didn't have time to waste. "Emily," he called, his voice low and urgent. She looked up at him, fear flickering in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She knew what was happening. She knew the danger wasn't over. "We're leaving now," Jake said, his voice firm. He motioned for her to follow him. She nodded, standing up shakily, her small form already moving toward the door. Jake grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly for reassurance. "I'm right here," he said, his voice soft but steady. They stepped out into the cold night air, the harsh wind biting at their faces. The cabin was small and isolated, and for a moment, Jake almost believed they might make it out without being noticed. But the sound of motorcycles growing louder told him otherwise. The bikers were close, closer than he had hoped. They couldn't stay here. This way, Jake said, pulling Emily toward the tree line. They ducked low, moving as quietly as they could through the thick brush. Jake's mind raced with thoughts of where they could go next. He had a cabin up in the hills, deep in the mountains. It wasn't far, but the path wasn't easy. They'd have to move quickly and stay off the main roads. Every step felt like an eternity as Jake led Emily through the dark forest. The branches whipped at their faces, but they kept moving, their feet crunching softly on the frozen ground. The sound of the motorcycles was getting closer, too close for comfort. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they picked up the pace, the cold air burning in his lungs. He wasn't about to let them get caught, not after everything she had been through. They were almost to the tree line when they heard it. The rumble of engines, followed by the screech of tires. "They found us," Jake muttered, his jaw tightening. He turned to Emily, who was looking up at him with wide eyes. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his voice sharp. He reached for the gun in his jacket, his finger tightening around the cold metal. Emily nodded, her body pressed close to his as they continued to move quickly through the trees. The sound of the bikers' engines grew louder, now mixed with the sound of shouting. They were closing in fast. Jake cursed again. They couldn't outrun them forever. He needed a plan. "We need to get to the cabin," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Stay close. Don't let them see you." They pushed forward, dodging branches and roots as they made their way through the thick underbrush. The bikers were getting closer. Jake could hear their voices now, yelling out for Emily. They were calling her name, and it made Jake's blood boil. They were getting desperate, and that made them dangerous. But Jake was more dangerous. The cabin wasn't far now. If they could just make it there. The sound of the engines stopped suddenly, and Jake froze. He could feel the tension in the air, the stillness before the storm. He motioned for Emily to stay quiet as he crouched low behind a thick tree. They waited. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, came from ahead. They were close. Too close. Jake's heart raced as he prepared for the worst. He wasn't about to let them take her. Not without a fight. Jake's grip on the gun tightened as the footsteps grew closer. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his breath steady. Emily, pressed up against him, seemed to be holding her breath too. He could feel her trembling beside him, her fear palpable, but she didn't make a sound. Jake knew that if they were going to make it out of this, they had to stay hidden, stay quiet. He turned his head slowly, just enough to glance at Emily. She was looking up at him, her eyes wide and filled with trust. For a moment, it hit him. He was responsible for this little life, for keeping her safe, for making sure she had a future. He couldn't fail her. The men's voices became clearer, their footsteps crunching closer to where Jake and Emily were crouched. Jake's pulse quickened, and he slowly reached for his knife, pulling it from its sheath with a soft hiss. He wasn't sure how many of them were out there, but it didn't matter. He had the element of surprise. The first man rounded the corner of the tree, his face lit by the faint glow of the moon. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, using the tree as cover. With a swift movement, he tackled the man to the ground, knocking the air from his lungs. The man gasped, but before he could yell out, Jake pressed his knife against his throat. "Stay quiet," Jake whispered, his voice low but firm. The man's eyes widened in fear, and he nodded. Jake didn't let up, keeping the knife pressed firmly against the man's skin. He could feel the man's heartbeat racing beneath his fingers. "Where are the others?" Jake asked, his voice cold. The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes darting around, searching for an escape. But Jake wasn't about to let him go that easily. He pressed the knife just a little harder, and the man flinched. "Where are the others?" Jake repeated, this time with more urgency. The man finally spoke, his voice shaky. "They're still behind us. We split up to cover more ground." Jake's mind raced as he processed the information. There were more of them, and they were getting closer. But there was still time. He had to finish this, make sure Emily was safe. "Get up," Jake ordered. The man complied, his movements stiff with fear. Jake kept the knife close, ready to strike at a moment's notice. He backed up slowly, leading the man toward the cabin. He didn't want to take any chances. Emily had to be kept safe. "You stay quiet," Jake warned the man again, his eyes narrowing. The man nodded, sweat dripping from his forehead. They reached the cabin door, and Jake's mind worked quickly. He needed to get rid of the man before the others arrived. He had no time to waste. Go, Jake said, shoving the man roughly toward the door. The man stumbled but quickly regained his balance, fear still evident in his eyes. Tell them to stay away from here, Jake added, his voice low and threatening. The man hesitated for a moment before he turned and ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Jake watched him go, making sure he didn't turn back. The last thing he needed was for the man to warn the others. Once the man was out of sight, Jake quickly turned back to Emily, his heart still racing. He motioned for her to stay close as he moved back to the window, keeping a lookout. The sounds of the engines from the bikes had stopped, but Jake wasn't ready to relax just yet. He knew the men were still out there, waiting for their chance. He had to make sure they didn't get it. He turned to Emily, his expression softening for a moment. It's not over yet, he said quietly, his voice reassuring. But I'm going to make sure you're okay. Emily nodded, her face still pale but determined. She was scared, but she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Jake moved to the back of the cabin, pulling open a hidden trapdoor in the floor. It led to a small cellar, a place he had used for hiding before. It wasn't much, but it would keep them out of sight. Get in, Jake said, helping Emily down the stairs. She didn't question him, didn't hesitate. She knew the danger was still real, and she trusted Jake. He pulled the door shut behind them and lit a small lantern, the soft glow casting long shadows on the walls. They sat in silence for a moment, both listening for any sounds from outside. The only noise was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Jake's mind kept racing, trying to formulate a plan. He couldn't keep hiding forever. He had to end this, but not yet. Not until he knew Emily was safe. They waited in the dark for what felt like hours, but nothing stirred outside. The bikes had gone silent. Jake leaned back against the wall, his eyes still scanning the shadows. Emily, exhausted from the tension of the day, had curled up on the floor, trying to get some sleep. But Jake couldn't rest. Not yet. He had a promise to keep. He had to make sure she would wake up to a world where she wasn't constantly running. A world where she could live without fear. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his fingers tight with frustration. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to stop fighting for that world. For Emily. The silence in the cellar was suffocating. Every creak of the old cabin above them felt like a thunderclap in Jake's ears. He sat against the wall, his eyes trained on the shadows, listening intently for any sign of movement. Emily had fallen asleep a while ago, her small frame curled up tightly on the cold floor. But Jake couldn't afford the luxury of rest. He had learned long ago that when you were on the run, sleep was a rare commodity. The only sound that filled the space was Emily's steady breathing, the soft flicker of the lantern casting faint shadows around the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, the rustling of the trees a constant reminder that the world was still out there, spinning in chaos. But for Jake, the world had narrowed down to one thing: keeping Emily safe. He glanced down at her, a pang of guilt rising in his chest. He had promised her safety, promised he would protect her. But every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into danger. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a motorcycle in the distance. Jake's heart stopped. His body tensed instinctively, his fingers reaching for the gun that rested in his jacket. The sound was faint, but it was enough. The bikers were back. He couldn't hear them clearly, but the engines roared louder with every passing second. Jake's pulse quickened as he silently moved toward the small window at the far end of the cellar. His eyes scanned the night, searching for any sign of the men. The faint flicker of headlights caught his attention, just beyond the tree line. The bikers were getting closer. They hadn't given up. His mind raced, calculating their movements. He had to make a decision. Now, he didn't want to risk Emily's safety any further. He had to get her out of here. He turned back to her, kneeling beside her on the floor. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion in them. She looked up at him, her face still pale, but her gaze steady. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Jake's heart clenched. He hadn't wanted to wake her, hadn't wanted her to know the danger they were in. But she had the right to know. "They're back," he said quietly. "The bikers. They found us." Emily's eyes widened in fear, but Jake gently placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her. "Stay close to me, okay?" We're not staying here any longer. She nodded silently, the fear in her eyes giving way to a quiet determination. Jake knew she was scared, but she wasn't giving up. Not yet. He helped her up, his grip firm but gentle. They had to move fast. He quickly opened the trapdoor, checking the surroundings before motioning for Emily to climb up first. They had to get to the woods, and they had to do it now. Emily stepped out of the cellar first, followed by Jake, his gun now securely in his hand. The cold night air hit them both like a slap in the face, but Jake barely noticed it. The only thing that mattered was keeping Emily safe. They moved quickly, quietly, staying low to the ground as they made their way toward the trees. The sound of the bikes was louder now, too close for comfort. Jake glanced back, his instincts telling him they were running out of time. "We have to move faster," he muttered, urging Emily forward. She didn't protest, her small hand gripping his tightly as they ran through the dark forest, the underbrush crunching beneath their feet. The shadows of the trees seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing them whole. Every step felt like it took them further away from safety, but Jake kept pushing forward, determined to get them out of this. They had no choice now. The bikers wouldn't stop. They would follow them, hunt them down. And Jake couldn't let that happen. The trees seemed to blur as they ran, the cold air burning in their lungs. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't slow down. He couldn't let Emily fall behind. He had to keep moving. After what felt like hours of running, they finally reached a clearing. The faint light of the moon filtered through the trees, and Jake stopped for a moment to catch his breath. He glanced over at Emily, who was panting but still steady, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for the next move. Jake's mind worked quickly. They needed to keep moving, but they couldn't keep running forever. He had to find a place to hide, a way to shake the bikers off. He scanned the clearing, his eyes landing on an old cabin in the distance. It looked abandoned, worn down by years of neglect. But it was better than nothing. "We'll head there," Jake said, pointing toward the cabin. Emily nodded, her face determined. They moved quickly again, the cabin now their goal. Every step felt like a risk, but they had no other choice. As they neared the cabin, Jake stopped and listened. The sound of the bikes was still out there, but the riders had to be getting closer. They had to get inside, and fast. "Stay close," Jake whispered, taking Emily's hand as they approached the door. He tested the handle, relieved when it turned. The door creaked open, and Jake motioned for Emily to go inside first. He followed her in, closing the door quietly behind them. The cabin was dark, cold, and empty, but it would do for now. They were safe, at least for the moment. Jake turned to Emily, who was standing in the middle of the room, her chest rising and falling with every breath. "We'll rest here for a while," he said quietly. "But we can't stay long. They'll be looking for us." Emily nodded silently, still processing everything that had happened. Jake knew it wasn't over. They had bought themselves some time, but the danger was far from gone. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. The cabin was cold, and the air inside felt thick with the weight of what had happened. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape outside, waiting for any signs of movement. The faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing that broke the silence. Emily sat on the floor, her back pressed against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She was trying to stay calm, but Jake could see the fear still in her eyes, that quiet terror that had been with her since the moment he found her. She had been through so much, too much for a girl her age. And Jake couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of responsibility. It was his job to keep her safe, but what if it wasn't enough? What if the bikers found them again? What if they were already too close? He shook his head, pushing the thought aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on those questions. Not now. He needed to focus. Emily needed him. He turned from the window and looked at her, his heart tightening as he saw the exhaustion on her face. "You okay?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. She looked up at him, her eyes tired, but she managed a small nod. "I'm fine," she whispered. Jake walked over to her, crouching down so he was at eye level. He could see how scared she was, how much she was holding in. She had been through things no child should ever experience, and now she was stuck with him, in a cabin far from home, running from men who would stop at nothing to get to her. Jake's heart clenched at the thought. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't fail her. "You don't have to be brave all the time," Jake said quietly. "You don't have to hide how scared you are. Emily looked at him, her lips trembling slightly. I'm scared, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want them to find us. Jake's chest tightened. He knew that fear. He had lived with it for years, that constant feeling of being hunted, always looking over your shoulder, never knowing when the next danger would come. But now, he had someone else to protect, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. I won't let them get to you, Jake promised, his voice firm, though the doubt still lingered in his mind. We're not going to let them hurt you again. Emily nodded slowly, though her expression was still filled with uncertainty. But what if they do? She asked, her voice cracking. What if they find us? Jake's heart ached as he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. He knew he couldn't guarantee her safety, not completely. But he could promise one thing. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not until she was safe. We'll keep moving, Jake said, his voice steady. I won't stop until we're somewhere safe. You hear me? Emily nodded, though she still looked unsure. Jake gave her a small smile, trying to reassure her. We've been through worse, and we'll get through this too. I won't let them win. Emily's eyes softened as she looked at him. For the first time in hours, Jake saw a flicker of hope in her expression. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake stood up, his mind already working on their next move. The bikers were still out there, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they found them. But he had to stay ahead of them. He had to keep them moving, keep them one step ahead. We'll leave at first light, Jake said, his voice firm. We need to find a new place, a place where they can't find us. Emily nodded, her eyes slowly closing as exhaustion finally caught up with her. Jake walked over to the small bed in the corner of the cabin, grabbing the blanket and spreading it over her. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching at how small and fragile she looked. She had been through so much, and yet, she was still fighting, still holding on. Jake knew that he had to do the same. He couldn't give up. He wouldn't. As Emily drifted off to sleep, Jake stood by the window once again, his eyes scanning the darkness. He had to keep watch. He had to stay alert. He couldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. The bikers were still out there. They were still looking for her. And Jake wasn't about to let them win. Not now. Not ever. The morning came too soon. Jake had barely slept, his mind racing the entire night as he listened to the wind howl outside and the distant crackling of branches under the weight of the storm. He had stayed by the window, watching for any movement, knowing that if the bikers were still out there, they wouldn't stop until they had Emily. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, Jake knew it was time to move. Emily was still asleep, her small form curled tightly under the blanket, her breathing steady but shallow. Jake couldn't help but watch her for a moment, his heart aching. She had been through so much in such a short time, and yet, there she was, trying to find a sense of peace, even if only for a few hours. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. The sound of the wind and the rustling trees outside brought him back to reality. The bikers were out there, and he could feel the tension in his gut tightening. He had to get her to safety. Jake quietly grabbed his gear and moved toward the door. He didn't want to wake Emily just yet. She needed to rest, but they couldn't afford to wait any longer. He glanced back one last time before stepping outside, his boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. The air was still, too still, and it sent a chill down his spine. He knew the bikers had to be nearby. The storm had kept most people inside, but not the bikers. They wouldn't be deterred by a little bad weather. Jake stood still for a moment, listening. He could hear nothing except the faint sound of his own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin. He knew they needed to move fast. The longer they stayed here, the more likely it was they would be found. He took a deep breath and motioned for Emily to come over. She had already woken up, her eyes wide with confusion, and she quickly got to her feet. We need to go now, Jake said, his voice calm but firm. Emily looked at him, her face filled with a mix of fear and determination. She didn't ask questions. She trusted him, and that's all Jake needed. They made their way quickly through the woods, Jake leading the way, his eyes darting around as he searched for any sign of danger. He had no plan, no clear destination, but he knew they couldn't stay on the path. The bikers would be patrolling, looking for them. They needed to stay off the roads and move quietly. The trees felt like a maze, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they ducked under branches and leaped over fallen logs. Every now and then, Emily would stumble, but Jake was always there, a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. He could see the fear in her eyes, but she kept moving forward, trusting him. The forest stretched on for what felt like miles. Every step felt like it brought them further from safety, but also closer to it. Jake knew he couldn't keep this up forever. They needed a safe place, and fast. But the forest was dense, and every sound made him tense. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They were getting close to a creek when Jake heard it, the sound of engines. His stomach sank. They were here. The bikers. He motioned for Emily to hide behind a thick tree, and she did, her eyes wide with panic. Jake crouched down, his hand on his gun as he listened carefully. The sound was getting closer, the rumble of the bikes unmistakable. He held his breath, watching. The shadows between the trees. He couldn't let them see him. Not now. Not when they were so close. The sound of the bikes was deafening as they passed by. So close Jake could almost feel the vibrations through the ground. He could hear their voices too, laughing, calling out, looking for her. His grip tightened on his gun. He could hear them just past the creek, moving slowly, searching. They hadn't seen him yet. Emily was still hiding, her small form barely visible behind the tree, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as he watched the bikers pass by. His muscles tensed, and he held his breath as one of them stopped just a few feet from where they were hiding. Jake's hand instinctively gripped the gun tighter. He didn't want to pull the trigger. He didn't want to get into a fight. But if it came down to it, he would do whatever it took to keep Emily safe. The man leaned against a tree, lighting a cigarette and talking to the others. The other bikers were a little farther down, but they had stopped too. They were waiting, keeping their eyes open. The tension in the air was thick, and Jake knew they couldn't stay here much longer. After what felt like an eternity, the bikers finally got back on their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they continued their search further down the trail. Jake let out a silent breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Emily was still huddled behind the tree, her small frame trembling with fear. Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but he knew they couldn't stop now. "We need to keep moving," he whispered softly, his voice firm but gentle. She nodded, not saying a word, and followed him through the woods again. Jake's eyes were constantly scanning, his senses heightened, but the further they moved, the more he felt the weight of everything on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to lose her now. He wouldn't. The hours dragged on as Jake and Emily continued through the dense forest, their steps careful and calculated, but their destination uncertain. The trees seemed to close in around them, their shadows long and foreboding as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every gust of wind that rustled the leaves, made Jake's muscles tense. He couldn't afford to be careless, not now. Emily, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear, stayed close behind him, her small hand gripping his jacket with a desperate need for reassurance. Jake could feel the weight of her fear, the trust she had placed in him, and he wouldn't, let her down. He glanced over his shoulder at her, noticing how pale she was, how the weight of the past few days had taken its toll. But despite everything, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, even if it was faint. She hadn't given up. She was still fighting. They had reached a clearing now, the soft light of the moon shining down through the canopy of trees. It was quiet here, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself a small breath of relief. They had managed to stay ahead of the bikers, but they weren't out of danger yet. He knew that. The sound of a motorcycle in the distance brought him back to reality. The bikers hadn't given up on them. The engines roared louder, a reminder that their pursuit was far from over. Jake's heart quickened, and he motioned for Emily to crouch down, her small form quickly falling into position behind a thick tree. They had to stay hidden, keep their movements slow, deliberate. Jake pressed his back against the rough bark of the tree, his gun still in hand, fingers itching for any sign of movement. Emily huddled next to him, her body tense as she tried to keep quiet, but Jake could feel the rapid pace of her breath against his arm. She was scared, and so was he. The motorcycles were getting closer, their loud engines cutting through the otherwise peaceful night. Jake could hear voices now, gruff and low, calling out for Emily. They were getting close. Jake's grip tightened around the gun. This was it. He had to make a choice. He couldn't keep running. He had to stand and fight. He could feel Emily's presence next to him, her fear mirroring his own, but he knew that they couldn't keep running forever. He looked down at her, his expression hardening with resolve. "Stay behind me," No matter what, Jake said, his voice firm. Emily nodded silently, her eyes wide with fear, but she trusted him. Jake slowly pulled himself from the tree, standing up as silently as possible. He crouched low, moving with purpose toward the edge of the clearing. He could see the headlights now, the shapes of the bikers silhouetted against the fading light. They were almost in the clearing. Jake wasn't sure how many of them were out there, but he wasn't going to let them get any closer. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever was coming next. As the first biker came into view, Jake didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, his feet moving silently through the grass, and tackled the man off his bike. The biker hit the ground with a thud, the wind knocked out of him, and before he could react, Jake had him pinned. "Stay down," Jake growled, pressing the gun to the man's chest. The biker's eyes widened in shock, but he stayed still. Jake quickly checked for more bikers, his heart racing. He couldn't risk any more surprises. He knew he didn't have long before the others realized something was wrong. The sound of more motorcycles approaching made him act quickly. He turned to Emily, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Get to the trees now," he commanded. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran, her small legs carrying her quickly into the cover of the forest. Jake stood up, keeping the gun trained on the man beneath him, his eyes scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. The other bikers were close. Jake didn't know how many were coming, but he had to be ready. The sound of more bikes filled the air, and Jake felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. He had to protect Emily, even if it meant facing down the entire gang. The next few moments felt like an eternity. Jake heard the sound of tires skidding across the dirt as another biker rounded the corner of the clearing. Without thinking, Jake launched himself forward, tackling the second man to the ground. The first biker tried to scramble to his feet, but Jake was faster. He was fueled by the same drive that had kept him alive through all the years of his violent past. The fight didn't last long. The second biker, thrown off balance by Jake's attack, quickly surrendered, his face contorted in fear. Jake wasn't giving them a chance to regroup. He grabbed the man's collar and pulled him close, his voice low and cold. "Tell your friends to back off. If you don't, I'll make sure you don't walk again." The man nodded quickly, sweat pouring down his face, his voice trembling as he spoke. We'll leave, just don't." Jake didn't wait for him to finish. He stood up, shoving the man away before moving quickly to rejoin Emily. She was standing at the edge of the trees, her eyes wide, watching him. "They won't be a problem anymore," Jake said, though his voice didn't hold the satisfaction it once might have. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But Emily was safe. For now. They both knew the danger wasn't completely gone, but at least for tonight, they had survived. Jake reached for her hand, his voice softer now. "Let's go. We have to keep moving." Emily nodded, still a little shaken, but she didn't pull away. Jake gave her a small, reassuring smile before leading her deeper into the woods. They weren't out of danger yet, but they were still standing. And that was enough for now.